I hope you enjoyed this very important Caribbean novel. When we think of the canon of Caribbean literature, the works accepted by most scholars as the quintessential examples of Caribbean writing, In the Castle of My Skin definitely belongs in this group. Published shortly after his arrival in London in 1953, Lamming develops a novel about the national identity of Barbados. According to Kenyan novelist, theorist, and activist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the novel's date of publication is significant. 1953 marks a great moment in the praxis of decolonization. It is a moment pregnant with the tension between what had been a century of European imperial ascendancy in the globe with French and British empires at the helm, and what was about to be the redrawing of the power map of the world by the forces of decolonization. This moment in the praxis, quite literally where the great forces of history come together, makes Lamming's novel similar to a time capsule, capturing a society right before a significant change reaches a nation. For all its depth and wealth, In the Castle of My Skin may be one of the most important novels published by a Caribbean writer. In this presentation, I hope to walk you through how this novel portrays Barbados and operates within a modernist design. I feel honored that I had the chance to meet George Lamming in person back in 2001, who was very kind and generous. George Lamming stands at the center of a galaxy of Caribbean writers beginning in the 1950s who began to write about their home countries with pride and distinction. This wave of nationalist literature, dubbed by Raphael Dalio as the West Indian literary renaissance of the 1950s, not only defined the Caribbean, but sparked the eventual move toward decolonization. Indeed, Ngugi notes that Lamming emerges at a high noon of anti-imperialism. To elaborate on this metaphor, Lamming positions himself for the showdown between the colonizer and the colonized, the metropole and the periphery, the bully and the victim. Instead of a quick draw, however, Lamming uses writing as his weapon. The pen is mightier than the sword. At the heart of Lamming's work is English and its political power. Often citing Shakespeare, Lamming dispels the one-sided debate a master has over the slave. The directive Prospero gives Caliban. Again, Ngugi explains. That is why Lamming's work as a whole is a continuous argument with Shakespeare in English. He must deconstruct the two icons to reveal the way they have been used as an enslaving aesthetic, in order to construct the foundation of a liberating aesthetic, reflecting a sovereign people whose capacity to imagine a new world, whole, unfragmented, is set free. Indeed, for someone as renowned as Ngugi, who wrote the seminal post-colonial work Decolonizing the Mind, this statement is a major compliment. Lamming shows us through multiple characters in the novel how colonialism has affected and indoctrinated them. More generally, as a writer and critic, Lamming developed a style, a form, a particular voice of critical intervention, which both anchors us to history while beckoning us to a future we have yet to construct. Lamming sees writing both as a cultural and political exercise that demands engagement with Caribbean society and a special duty of responsibility. Anthony Borges, editor of the George Lamming Reader, elaborates. Such a responsibility means calling to order, speaking against the grain while writing against the conventional styles which mark the Caribbean novel of the nationalist period. In the Castle of My Skin, with a careful reading, becomes a complex text that reveals challenges and rewards on every page. As a modernist, Lamming wants readers to search for answers to problems and inconsistencies in the book that may at first seem odd or poorly designed. However, with special attention and critical thinking, the book's magical writing and structure allows one to see how revolutionary it is. Encountering British literature and culture as a colonial student offered a foundation to his educational and writing backgrounds. On moving to London in 1950, Lamming joined a large group of scholars, writers, and philosophers from all across the British Empire, including the West Indies, Africa, and the newly independent India. This interaction, in its own solitary processing of his immigration, fueled a re-examination of his British-based education. Consequently, post-colonial scholar and critic Simon Gikandi argues that Lamming's exile in London, along with other Caribbean colonials during the 1950s, formed his nationalism pertaining to Barbados. Here, exile explicitly generates nationalism in its corollary discursive and narrative strategies. In other words, his difference as an other, capital O, signifying his otherworldliness, his oppression, among white Londoners alongside others, capital O, produced a latent Barbadian identity that was suppressed and or silent in his colonial Caribbean life. In summary, his work is simultaneously a product, a reflection, and a celebration of a people making history. The quotes in this slide speak to Lamming's concepts pertaining to fiction and writing. In the first quote, Lamming explains the role fiction must play in the world, offering a way to attain an absolute truth. This belief in absolute truth aligns Lamming with other modernists who tried to seek and represent truth in their works. In the second quote, we can see why novels are important to understand Caribbean literature. Novels provide a more complete picture of society and history. They are necessary to promote change within readers and the public at large. The third quote is the most profound in my opinion because it succinctly explains how colonization impacts the soul, the intellect, and the psychology of the oppressed. To overcome the constant self-mutilation, one has to reassemble oneself and free the mind through cultural education. In the final quote, recovering an African identity can provide the necessary cultural reappropriation. Lamming extends this idea and says, quote, Africa invades us like an invisible force we dare not acknowledge, fearing the journey may take us beyond the boundaries of our approved instruction. End quote. It is the artist's job to move people on that journey. George Lamming was born in Carrington, near the outskirts of the capital of Bridgetown. Creighton's village, the primary setting in the book, was modeled after this town. Barbados gets its name from the Portuguese word barbados, meaning the bearded ones. Although the reference to that name has not been found, many believe that the bearded ones pertain to the bearded fig trees that grew native to the island. Slaves also called the island Bim, taking the Igbo name for home to refer to the island. The island also has been dubbed Bimshire to refer to a county in England. Additionally, as we learn from In the Castle of My Skin, Barbados was called Little England, referring both to its geographic and geological similarities with England, i.e., both being islands and both having rugged coastlines. Little England, of course, also designates Barbados's exceptionalism within the British Empire, for much of the economy and culture followed British needs and protocols. Indeed, if India was the jewel in the crown of Imperial Britain, Barbados was the jewel upon the right hand of Imperial Britain, working to fulfill England's economic needs. Britain used the island as a destination for poor, unemployed Irish and Scottish as indentured servants. Forever seeing Barbados in the image of England, the Central Highland area is named Scotland. As we will explore in a few slides, slavery dominated this island's history. Before moving on, let's look at Lamming's portrayal of Little England with the schoolyard scene. As tradition dictates, the primary school children assemble to honor Queen Victoria's birthday. The school puts on a show for the inspector, a member of the colonial government, to show their obedience, discipline, and precision with the marching exercises for the Queen. Lamming writes, the sun was big in the sky, and it shone bright and steady over the pebbles. The green coconuts shone in the church windows and the galvanized sheets of iron that roofed the school. Everything seemed a heavy tussle of light. The wind came in sharp spasms, and the flags flew. The school was a uniform of flags. The pervading, perhaps invading, brightness of the day makes this demonstration all the more powerful to the observers. However, for the students, symbolically the pebbles, this exercise is a display of obedience and conformity. Significantly, the students become swallowed by the amount of colors of more flags. There were small flags and big flags, round flags and square flags, flags with sticks and flags without sticks. and flags that wore the faces of kings and princes and ships and thrones and empires. Everywhere the red and the white and the blue. In every corner of the school, the tricolored Union Jack flew its message. The colors, though three in number, had by constant repetition produced something vast and terrible, a kind of pressure or presence of which everyone was a part. Lamming makes it clear that the students become overwhelmed by the vast and terrible pressure and presence they are a part of. By explaining this ceremony at a school, Lamming is showing how cultural imperialism, or internal psychological colonization, occurs. Defined by theorists as hegemony, this brand of colonization is extremely harmful and long-lasting. For this reason, the flag and its message have profound repercussions. Lamming explains these thusly. 300 years more than the memory could hold, Big England had met and held Little England, and Little England, like a sensible child, accepted. 300 years, and never in all that time did any other nation dare interfere with these two. Barbados, or Little England, was the oldest and purest of England's children, and may it always be so. Indeed, it was God's doing. Employing the modernist device of irony here, Lamming makes the readers aware of Britain's manipulation of the people of Barbados, who have been co-opted in their own oppression by believing that God produced this allegiance. Instead, the British systems, especially its educational apparatuses, foster this alliance. They are children to them. This concept of devaluing the people, reducing them to children, also corresponds to the paternalism that justified slavery. Slavery and its legacies dominates the culture, history, economy, ecology, and society of the region. Slavery produced multicultural societies in many nations. Slavery created plantation economies that had absentee landowners or a handful of white owners over large areas and populations of slaves. While slavery is over at the time of In the Castle of My Skin, the plantation culture still exists. The characters live on the Creighton family land and still work for them. The supervisor is still called an overseer as well. The Creightons in the novel represent the small faction of white elites that lived on Barbados and other islands. Slavery also decimated the ecology of many islands, where ancient trees were clear-cut to make room for sugar fields and plantations. The patterns of exploitation created by slavery and colonialism still haunt many Caribbean nations. Despite this legacy, peoples in the Caribbean are warm, friendly, and happy. Slavery in Barbados was a major industry. The top chart shows the total number of slaves that disembarked in specific regions throughout the British Caribbean. More slaves, a total of 489,062, were brought into Barbados than the entire United States, a total of 472,381, as seen in the chart in the middle. Lamming channels this history through the old man Pa, who dreams at one point of Africa. Because of the long colonial history of Barbados, the slave system was extensive and brutal at times. The quote below the charts explains one law that passed on the island circa 1688. The law reads as follows. For offenses such as stealing or the destruction of goods, the slave, if convicted and found guilty, was to be publicly and severely whipped, not exceeding 40 lashes. If the slaves repeated the said offense, they could have his or their noses slit and be branded in the forehead with a hot iron, that the mark thereof may remain. If the slave was found guilty a third time, then such negro or other slave for that third offense shall be adjudged and suffer death. This punishment set the foundation for slave systems and methods of subjugation across the New World. Indeed, many South Carolina and Georgia planters had Barbadian roots and received training in Barbados on how to operate a plantation and manage slaves. According to research published through the College of Charleston, many of the proprietors of the early Carolina colonies sent representatives to study the lucrative sugar plantation system on the Caribbean island of Barbados. They also recruited white settlers from this English West Indian colony to help launch their new North American settlement. These white Barbadians often brought enslaved Africans and African Barbadians with them. With this fact, it is little wonder why George Washington, one of the richest men in the United States, traveled to Barbados, the only location beyond the states that he ever traveled to. Modernism, at its simplest, is the recovery of a loss through innovative means. This loss can be personal, as an identity, or from a trauma, collective, like a generation or population, or from a shared experience, and or cultural, from a sudden shift emerging from external forces, technological changes, and or social movements. Innovation, or newness, can be witnessed in various cultural products like paintings, music, literature, architecture, etc. In the case of Caribbean literature, modernist writers such as Wilson Harris, John Carew, Jean Rhys, and others developed works heavily dependent upon stream of consciousness, i.e., shifting the point of view within a work onto the interior voice/mind of a narrator or other central characters. These writers, and Lamming as well, focus on the recuperative power of the past, using history and cultures, especially those suppressed through colonialism, African, Amerindian, and others, to reshape how their stories are told. Consequently, Lamming's novels are the site of ideas, according to Borges. Additionally, Kakandi finds another important reason for his modernism. There's a sense which Lamming, like many colonialized writers of his generation, turned to writing as a way of dealing with certain fundamental anxieties about Caribbean nationalism and some apprehension about the colonized writer's ability to evoke a national consciousness from fragments left behind by colonial rule. Dalio concludes that the novel provides a case for seeing politics as internal to every activity, as what gives meaning and authority to even the literary. Lamming specifically discusses the fractured consciousness of the Caribbean peoples, a deep split in its sensibility which now raised difficult problems of language and values. The whole issue of cultural allegiance between the imposed norms of white power, represented by a small numerical minority, and the fragmented memory of the African masses, between white instruction and black imagination. In The Castle of My Skin tries to suture this split. At the root of Lamming's modernist project lies the concept of sovereignty. According to Ngugi, sovereignty emerges with the subject freed from his subjugation to an oppressing other, free to regain his own subjectivity as an agent of his being. For to be subject to another, an oppressing other, be he a foreigner or a national, is to have one's capacity for imagining a different future limited. In a colonial context, this sovereignty is not yet realized. It is an ideal for which to struggle. Striving for this ideal, moving toward the fully realized self, is Lamming's modernism at work within the novel. Lamming's use of stream of consciousness is his attempt to free the voice of his subjects from the oppressive economic situations they find themselves in. The quote above shows one example of stream of consciousness. His most powerful example is the teacher's chapter. Nonetheless, above, G, the main character we follow most in the book, recounts his 9th birthday in his room. Haunted by the trauma of the flood and its destruction of the land and people, G feels trapped among phantoms. More than just a nightmare, these phantoms are perhaps the anxieties of bombarding him over his life as a poor black. We can see his desire for sovereignty here. The book's title stands as another example of G's desire for identity and wholeness. Moving away from his stylized stream of consciousness from earlier chapters, Lamming creates a structural stream of consciousness through a journal. In one entry from April, near the conclusion of his school year, G explains the conflict he feels as an educated young man among his people. I have always been here on this side, and the other person there on that side. And we have both tried to make these sides appear similar in the needs, desires, and attributions. But it is not true. It was never true. When I reach Trinidad, where no one knows me, I may be able to strike identity with the other person, but it was never possible here. The main character feels that he cannot resolve his conflict and the desire to change himself within the confines of Creighton's village in Barbados. He must move on and find himself without the moorings of his mother and the community. Indeed, he feels trapped at the present time. I'm always feeling terrified of being known, not because they really know me, but because their claim to this knowledge is a concealed attempt to destroy you. While the rhetoric of this quote is harsh or extreme, it speaks to the trap of being educated among the poor. It is impossible to be yourself in their eyes. You are better or different, and therefore not one of them anymore, despite what you do. Still, Lamming wants this man to forge ahead in Trinidad and become someone who can appreciate himself. They won't know the you that's hidden somewhere in the castle of your skin. This metaphor, the castle, reverses the imperial imagery that dominates the main character's education. This castle will be internal and cherished, for it will give value to himself and allow him to celebrate his blackness, his African heritage, his skin. Only a novel, and not poetry, can allow for this evolution to take place. Lamming makes it necessary to understand Caribbean literature through novels. This turn to the novel, away from the poetry written in earlier Caribbean generations, is important, according to Candy. Lamming and his circle were attracted to the novel because they believed that narrative offered a form and strategy for restoring the West Indian character to history. By reading this book, we can see how Barbados and its people have been restored. To this point, I think you can begin to appreciate Lamming's modernism. In The Castle of My Skin, though, can be frustrating to read because of its decentralized, fragmentary structure. Vignettes and even dramatically organized prose between the old man and the old woman, Pa and Ma, make the novel challenging to follow. Critically speaking, Candy offers one explanation for the novel. A first-person autobiographical method is often mixed with streams of consciousness. Note here that Candy calls it streams of consciousness, multiple characters' internal thoughts. In her introduction to the book, Sandra Pouchet notes how the narrative is both singular and collective. It is about one boy among the other boys in the village community in which they are raised. Pouchet elaborates in detail on this design. Lamming's strategy is to split the narrative into contrastive but complementary first and third person modes of narration that blur the boundaries between author and authorial persona and between the constitutive parts of the authorial persona. The first person narrative is primarily the autobiographical account of a uniquely experienced childhood filtered through memory and imagination, a portrait of the artist as a young man. The third person narrative is concerned with the problems of the community as they are experienced by others, adults and children, whether or not they could have been perceived or understood by the child or adolescent. In many ways, the quote above represents the book's design. 3 becomes 13, becomes 30, becomes 300. The pattern of life remains constant. For this reason, Lamming himself states that the village is the central character. Lamming's declaration makes the novel difficult to see as a Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age story of a central character. However, our main protagonist does grow mature into a new self. In many ways, In the Castle of My Skin resembles a short story cycle or cycle novel, where a setting takes the stage to portray one person's interaction and development against that background. Dugugi finds that the narrative structure of In the Castle of My Skin reflects the centrality of people in history. As a method, Bouquet writes, autobiographical time is linked to village and island history embryonically and geologically. Bouquet presents a compelling conclusion. In the context of In the Castle of My Skin as a whole, the alternative consciousness of the third-person narrator signals the development of a specific race and class consciousness in the author that is only marginally present in the developing subjectivity of the implied author as a young man. Consequently, Trumper's story concludes the book to remind us that the world, especially the black world, is larger than Barbados. By using this structure, Lamming suggests that all Caribbean peoples, nations, and those former slaves in the New World have a common history and an identity that needs to be heard. Please use these sources to explore the book Lamming and Barbados more.